In 2005, Ford faced a crisis. The Mustang, America's original pony car, the machine that had defined affordable performance for 4 decades, was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, in the way that hurts most. Sales were slipping, enthusiasts were losing faith. And the engine under the hood, a tired pushrod V8 that traced its lineage back to the 1960s, was becoming an embarrassment. The competition had moved on. The Camaro was dead, sure, but the imports were everywhere, and they were faster, more efficient, and frankly, more interesting. Ford needed a miracle. What they got was a 5-liter engine that would become one of the most celebrated power plants in modern automotive history. This is the story of the Coyote V8 and how it saved the Mustang from becoming irrelevant. Along the way, we'll encounter corporate politics, engineering breakthroughs, a devoted community of modifiers, and a machine that proved you could have power and efficiency at the same time. So let's begin. But first, how did Ford get into this mess in the first place? To understand why the Coyote mattered, you have to understand what came before it. And honestly, what came before it was kind of sad. The original 5.0, the one from the Fox body era, was legendary. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, the 5.0 Mustang was the affordable performance car in America. It wasn't sophisticated, it wasn't elegant, but it made good power, it was dead simple to modify, and it sounded absolutely incredible. That pushrod V8 became the heartbeat of an entire generation of enthusiasts. But here's the thing, by the time the new millennium rolled around, that engine architecture was ancient. The 4.6-liter modular V8 that replaced it in 1996 was technically superior in almost every way. It was smoother, more refined, more modern, but it committed the cardinal sin of performance cars. It was boring. The modular engine made decent power, sure, but it lacked the character of the old 5.0. It didn't have that immediate throttle response, that raw mechanical feel that made the original so beloved. And then there was the efficiency problem. By the mid-2000s, fuel economy standards were tightening. The old approach of just adding displacement wasn't going to work anymore. Ford needed an engine that could make serious horsepower while still meeting increasingly strict emissions and fuel economy requirements. Now I should mention something important here. The name Coyote wasn't just marketing, it was a deliberate callback to Ford's heritage. Back in the 1960s, Ford had a racing program that used the name Coyote for their Indy car efforts. Choosing that name was a signal. Ford was serious about performance again. The development program started in 2007, and the engineers had a clear mandate: create a naturally aspirated V8 that could compete with anything on the market. No turbochargers, no superchargers from the factory. Just displacement, engineering, and as much power per liter as they could squeeze out. The team, led by some of Ford's best engine engineers, made some bold decisions early on. They were going to use 4 valves per cylinder, which wasn't new, but they were also going to implement twin-independent variable cam timing. This was the key. By allowing the intake and exhaust camshafts to adjust their timing independently, the engine could optimize itself for different conditions. Want low-end torque for pulling away from a stoplight? Adjust the timing. Want maximum horsepower at high RPM? Adjust it again. The engine could, in a sense, change its personality based on what you were asking it to do. See, this is what made the Coyote different from previous Ford V8s. It wasn't just powerful, it was intelligent. The variable cam timing meant it could be docile and efficient around town, then absolutely savage when you put your foot down. The first-generation Coyote, which appeared in the 2011 Mustang GT, made 412 horsepower and 390 pound-feet of torque. Now, that might not sound revolutionary today, but think about the context. This was a naturally aspirated engine, making 82 horsepower per liter. That was supercar territory. The previous 4.6-liter modular V8 made around 300 horsepower. Ford had added over 100 horsepower while actually improving fuel economy. That's not supposed to be possible. The response from enthusiasts was immediate and overwhelming. Finally, a Mustang that could compete with the Corvette. Finally, an engine that revved like it wanted to, that sounded like an American V8 should sound, that responded to modifications like the old 5.0 used to. And that's when everything changed. The aftermarket community, which had been somewhat dormant during the modular years, woke up. Within months, companies were offering supercharger kits, intake systems, exhaust setups, and tune packages for the new Coyote. The engine responded to modifications beautifully. A simple bolt-on supercharger could push power past 600 horsepower on the stock internals. More aggressive builds were breaking 1,000 horsepower without major problems. But Ford wasn't done. They kept developing the engine, generation after generation, and each version was better than the last. The second generation, which arrived in 2015, bumped power to 435 horsepower, but the real changes were underneath. Ford added their charge motion control valves, which optimized airflow at different RPM ranges. They also improved the cylinder head design, allowing for better flow at high RPM. The result was an engine that revved more freely and made more power at the top of the tash. The 2015 Mustang also brought something else important: independent rear suspension. Now, I know this sounds like a chassis detail rather than an engine story, but stay with me. The old solid rear axle had been holding the Mustang back for years. No matter how much power you had, putting it down was always a challenge. The new independent setup meant that all the Coyote horsepower could actually get to the ground. The car transformed from a muscle car into something that could genuinely handle. By 2018, Ford introduced the third-generation Coyote, and this is where it gets really interesting. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question: where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's what Ford did for the third generation. They added direct injection alongside the existing port injection. Now, most manufacturers pick one or the other. Direct injection gives better fuel economy and more precise fuel delivery, but it can cause carbon buildup on the intake valves. Port injection is less efficient, but keeps the valves clean. Ford said, why not use both? The dual injection system was brilliant. Under light loads, the engine primarily used direct injection for maximum efficiency. Under heavy loads, both systems worked together to deliver the fuel the engine needed. Power jumped to 460 horsepower, and the engine could now rev to a stratospheric 7,500 RPM. For a production pushrod, modular, no, this was a whole new thing. The Coyote had become something unique. The sound at high RPM was unlike anything Ford had made before. It didn't sound like the old 5.0, which was all torque and rumble. The new Coyote screamed. It had this high-pitched wail at the top of the tack that sounded more like a European exotic than an American muscle car. Some people loved it, some preferred the old sound, but nobody could deny the thing was making serious power, and the modifiability only improved. With the stronger internals required for the higher compression ratio and dual injection system, the third-gen Coyote could handle even more boost. Builds pushing 1,500 horsepower started appearing on the drag strip. The engine had become a platform, a starting point for enthusiasts who wanted to build something truly crazy. But here's what I think really matters about the Coyote's impact. It proved that the American V8 wasn't dead. See, throughout the 2000s, there was this narrative that the naturally aspirated V8 was a dinosaur, too heavy, too thirsty, too unsophisticated for the modern era. Everyone was supposed to downsize to turbocharged 4 cylinders or move to electric. The V8 was portrayed as this relic of a less enlightened time, something your dad drove, not something serious engineers would waste their time on. The Coyote proved that wrong. Here was an engine that met all the modern requirements while still delivering the experience enthusiasts wanted. It was efficient enough to satisfy regulators, powerful enough to satisfy enthusiasts, and refined enough to satisfy customers who just wanted a nice car. Ford had threaded an impossible needle. I mention this because the Coyote's success changed how other manufacturers thought about their performance programs. General Motors, watching the Mustang steal sales from the temporarily discontinued Camaro, rushed to bring back their pony car with an equally impressive engine. The LT1 that powered the new Camaro was clearly developed with the Coyote as the benchmark to beat. Dodge, meanwhile, doubled down on displacement with the Hellcat program, taking a different approach, but clearly responding to the same competitive pressure. The Coyote didn't just save the Mustang, it kicked off a new horsepower war. Now, let's talk about what the enthusiast community did with this engine, because honestly, that's where the story gets really fun. The Coyote swap became a thing, not just for Mustangs, but for everything. People started dropping these engines into Fox body cars, into classic trucks, into completely inappropriate vehicles that had no business having 460 horsepower. The aftermarket support exploded. You could buy swap kits, wiring harnesses, motor mounts, everything you needed to put a Coyote into basically whatever you wanted. There's something beautiful about that. An engine so good that people went to enormous trouble to put it in cars it was never designed for. The old 5.0, the Windsor V8, had that same quality. People loved it so much they would do anything to make it fit. The Coyote inherited that legacy. The racing community embraced it too. In road racing, the Coyote became a popular choice for endurance events and time attack competitions. Its ability to rev high without reliability concerns made it ideal for track use. In drag racing, the stronger internals meant you could add power without worrying about grenading the engine. Coyote-powered cars started showing up in every category, and Ford noticed. They started offering the Coyote as a crate engine, specifically targeting the enthusiast market. You could buy a brand new Coyote from Ford Performance, complete with a control pack that included everything needed to wire it into a standalone vehicle. The company that made the engine was now actively encouraging people to put it in other things. Think about that. Ford was essentially saying, yes, please, take our best engine and do crazy stuff with it. The fourth generation arrived in 2024, and Ford pushed the envelope even further. Power increased again to 486 horsepower in the Mustang GT. But the bigger news was the Dark Horse variant, which received a version making 500 horsepower naturally aspirated. 1,000 horsepower from a naturally aspirated V8 that you could daily drive. No supercharger required, just engineering. The Dark Horse engine featured new connecting rods, a revised oiling system, and various other upgrades borrowed from Ford's racing programs. It was, in effect, a factory-built version of what enthusiasts had been doing themselves for years. Ford had watched what the community was doing with their engine and incorporated those lessons into the production version. That's remarkable. Usually the factory and the aftermarket exist in separate worlds. The factory builds the base, the aftermarket modifies it, and never the two shall meet. With the Coyote, Ford created a feedback loop. The aftermarket pushed the engine further, Ford observed what worked, and the next generation incorporated those improvements. The enthusiasts and the engineers were, in a sense, collaborating. Now, here's where we need to talk about the bigger picture. Because the Coyote didn't just save the Mustang, it might have saved Ford's performance credibility entirely. Throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, Ford was struggling with its identity. They had this incredible racing heritage, this history of Le Mans victories and NASCAR championships and Trans Am dominance. But the actual products in the showrooms didn't reflect that heritage. The Focus was fine, but uninspiring. The Fusion was a rental car. The trucks were great, but they weren't exciting. Ford felt like a company living on past glory. The Coyote-powered Mustang changed that perception. Suddenly, Ford had a performance car that could genuinely compete with anything on the market. Magazine comparisons that had previously ended with the Mustang, as an also-ran, started going Ford's way. The car won tests against the Camaro, against the Challenger, against European sports cars that cost twice as much. And then Ford did something even more ambitious. They put the Coyote in the new Ford GT. Okay, wait, that's not quite right. Let me correct myself. The GT used an EcoBoost twin-turbo V6, not the Coyote. But the GT program was born from the same renewed performance focus that the Coyote had enabled. Ford had gotten their confidence back. They were willing to spend money on performance again, to go racing at Le Mans again, to build limited production supercars again. The Coyote didn't directly create that, but it was part of the same cultural shift within the company. The Mustang became Ford's calling card. When people thought of Ford, they thought of that high-revving V8, that distinctive exhaust note, that affordable supercar performance. The Coyote had become an identity. There were challenges along the way, of course. The shift to the S550 platform in 2015 brought complaints about weight. The car had gotten heavier with the new independent suspension and improved refinement. Some enthusiasts missed the raw, unpolished character of the older cars. The Coyote made more power, but the car weighed more to move. Ford responded by offering performance packages that stripped out weight and added track-focused hardware. The Shelby GT350, which arrived with a completely different engine, proved Ford was willing to go to extremes for enthusiasts. But the regular GT with the Coyote remained the volume play, the car that most people could actually afford. And what of the engineers who created this engine? The lead program engineer, an enthusiast himself who had grown up working on Mustangs, stayed with Ford and continued developing the platform. Many of the team members went on to work on other performance programs, including the Shelby variants and the Ford GT project. The Coyote had been their masterpiece, and the company rewarded them with even more ambitious assignments. The manufacturing team deserves credit, too. The Coyote was built at Ford's Romeo engine plant in Michigan, alongside other high-performance engines. The precision required for the tight tolerances of a modern high-performance engine, the quality control needed to ensure every Coyote met specifications, that's not easy at volume. Ford was building tens of thousands of these engines every year, and the failure rate remained remarkably low. There's a lesson there for the broader automotive industry. The conventional wisdom said that performance and efficiency were enemies, that you had to choose one or the other. The Coyote proved that with enough engineering talent and enough investment, you could have both. It wasn't cheap to develop. Ford spent hundreds of millions on the program, but the result was an engine that defined a generation of American performance. Looking at where we are now, with electric vehicles taking over more and more of the market, the Coyote might represent the peak of naturally aspirated V8 development. Not because the technology couldn't go further, but because the regulatory environment won't allow it. Emission standards continue to tighten. Fuel economy requirements continue to increase. The window for big, powerful, naturally aspirated engines is closing. That makes the Coyote even more special. It arrived at exactly the right moment, when the technology was mature enough to deliver incredible performance, but before the regulations made such an engine impossible to produce. Future enthusiasts looking back at this era will see the Coyote as the last great expression of what a naturally aspirated American V8 could be. Ford understood this. That's why they kept developing it, kept improving it, kept finding ways to extract more power while meeting emissions requirements. They knew the clock was ticking. Every generation of the Coyote was built with the understanding that it might be the last. The community understood it too. The passion around Coyote-swapped builds, the investment in modification and tuning, the dedication to keeping these engines alive that comes from the recognition that what we have is special and might not last forever. But here's what I find most remarkable about the whole story. Ford almost didn't do it. In the mid-2000s, there were serious discussions about abandoning the V8 entirely, about moving the Mustang to a turbocharged six-cylinder or even a four-cylinder platform. The bean counters had their spreadsheets showing how much money could be saved. The regulators were pushing for smaller, more efficient engines. The easy path was to give up on the V8. The engineers and enthusiasts inside Ford refused. They argued, they pushed back. They presented data showing what was possible with modern engineering. They convinced the leadership that the V8 was essential to the Mustang's identity, that customers would not accept a Mustang without a proper V8 option. And then they delivered an engine that proved their point. The Coyote exists because people cared enough to fight for it, not just in the engineering labs, but in the executive suites where budgets were decided. The story of the Coyote is partly a story about engineering excellence, but it's also a story about corporate courage. Ford bet big on American V8 performance at a time when the smart money was moving away from it. And that is the story of the Coyote, an engine that saved the Mustang, revived Ford's performance reputation, and proved that the American V8 could still compete in the modern era. 15 years after its introduction, it remains one of the greatest engines ever made, a benchmark that competitors still struggle to match, and the heartbeat of one of America's most iconic cars. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.